All right. Hi, everyone watching. I'm Molly Jane, the opinion editor at Blockworks, and I'll be leading this panel today that's entitled Bitcoin and the SEC. Do BRC 20s change the picture? So before we begin, I just would like to introduce our panelists. We have with us Jason of OKX. We have John from Clyde, Marissa from the Blockchain Association, and Josh from Linklaters. So thank you guys all so much for being here. Let's just dive right in. So, the idea about Bitcoin and the SEC and unregistered securities is a hot topic. If you guys have been looking at Twitter in the past 20 minutes, you saw that Ripple just got some sort of partial clarity. But we're not talking about Ripple today. We're talking about Bitcoin. So, I think just sort of the first general question I want to ask, just for the audience's understanding, what are BRC20 tokens? How are they different from ERC20 tokens? And why could these specific new technological things be considered to potentially run afoul of the SEC or US security regulations?
Hey, Molly, maybe I'll jump in first.
Sure,
cool.
Great.
Yeah, so I'm Jason. I'm from OKX. Thanks for having me. We have an OKX wallet, which is a non-custodial, self-custodial wallet, which does support BRC20 and ordinals trading. And so just to answer your question specifically, I don't think the SEC is supposed to be technology neutral. And so whether it's a BRC20 or ERC20 or anything other for that matter, it really depends on the facts and circumstances of that specific token and the issuer and all that. And so, there are better lawyers here on this call today, and that can really get into the specifics. But that's really where we look at it, right? These are tokens, and when it comes to decentralized permissionless trading, which our wallet does support, I think the specific tokens and those circumstances will be sort of we'll see what the SEC says about that.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy. Oh, go ahead, Josh.
No, go ahead. I can wait.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Marissa Koppel. I'm senior counsel at the Blockchain Association. So Ripple was just decided maybe like an hour ago, and there was an interesting nugget in the order that is somewhat relevant to this. Oh, sorry, my computer just lost its charge. Okay. So the court in the order made a very clear point to explain that a token itself does not constitute an investment contract, and that a court has to analyze the circumstances surrounding the sale of the token. So that's really important in this context. Just to follow up to what Jason was saying, is in the past, up until now, and keep in mind that this order is just a district court order, so it doesn't necessarily set precedent. But up until now, the SEC's position was that all tokens, except for Bitcoin, which Chair Gensler has said over and over again, are securities and constitute an investment contract. And that might change a little bit after this order, just given how clear the court was on that point, and that each transaction itself has to be analyzed. So as to whether BRC20 tokens themselves are investment contracts, I think we have some positive language that the tokens themselves are not, and you have to look at the transaction as a whole.
Yeah, and I would just say, building on what Marissa was just saying, which I agree with, I think one of the things people will have to get used to is this idea, though, of, up until now, with respect to Bitcoin specifically, there's been, okay, Bitcoin is a commodity, right? And we don't need to think about it necessarily from what is the transaction in the same way that we thought about ERC20 tokens. So just as in the past, and obviously this is all subject to updating based on, on developments that have just come out today and that will continue to be refined, because certainly I think many of us are still poring over the order and trying to read it more closely. But I think really by having ordinals, one of the really amazing things is that it expands uses, right, potentially. of the Bitcoin blockchain. At the same time, you have to think about how is something offered? How is it marketed? How is it sold? Just as if we think back to the former director of the SEC, Hinman's speech, where he had said that in his view, current day offers and sales of Ether, the native token of the Ethereum blockchain, were not securities. That did not necessarily have, that didn't necessarily absolve all of the ERC20 tokens and the sales transactions rather from necessarily being subject to scrutiny as securities. But of course, even the language with which we're talking about this is subject to change based on today's developments.
Yeah, it ended up being a very timely, a very timely panel. Let's see. I would be curious to hear from John, also coming from a lawyer background. One of the things I've noticed, just like being a journalist in crypto for so long, is there are so many projects that are so careful about using the word crypto, removing the word crypto, being very not forward thinking. I think it was Paradigm that recently put crypto back onto its webpage. It used to be off its webpage. Do you see that same sort of wariness with building in the Bitcoin space, or are people just trying to build and they'll deal with the SEC later if they have to?
Thanks for the question. And just by way of quick clarification, I am not a lawyer. I did spend a fateful summer in law school, and if I told you how poorly it went, you would never have me on this panel. But I do think there's an interesting point here that Bitcoin's brand is distinct from that of other crypto tokens. And I think those who are supporters of Bitcoin, just from a communication standpoint, have to think about how they want to develop that brand moving forward. And politically, whether they see their fortunes tied up with other crypto tokens and the rulings that we get maybe from courts or the decisions by the SECs or not, or whether politically for Bitcoin supporters, it makes the most sense to keep developing this distinct brand and reach a kind of regulatory solution that is distinct for it and not necessarily for other crypto tokens.
Interesting. Let's see. The next thing I kind of wanted to touch on a little bit here is if anyone is familiar really with what's going on right now in the BRC20 or the ordinal space, because the things that I've been reading, just in my job, working in news, is that it's a lot of meme tokens. I saw that article last week that several ordinals are moving into Ethereum. Maybe if someone that's more familiar than I am could sort of classify what's going on there, right now.
Yeah, I can jump in, Molly. I think you're right. It's still early. I know we're about 6 months in since ordinals really came onto the scene. Our wallet added support for trading, inscribing, and all that about a month ago. And very quickly, we saw that there was a lot of interest in these meme tokens that you referenced. And I think people are having fun. They're experimenting. It is a bit different from ERC20 tokens that you mentioned. The mechanics are different. The tokens themselves are obviously different in the way you store them and interact with them. So people are having a little bit of fun right now, I think. And we'll see over time how those communities build up and what those use cases come out to be. One thing that we are working with, we proposed a open source standard on sort of extending the BRC20 token protocol to support for more complex transactions such as staking. And I think that's something we're going to be launching later this month. And we're already seeing some interest in the community whereby they're going to see how they can bring some of these staking functions into their tokens. So I think we're early. It's going to be exciting to see.
Yeah, we're early. I feel like that's one of everyone's favorite phrases. I wonder if we'll ever be late after 5 years working here. All right. The next question I wanted to direct towards Marissa and the Blockchain Association, because I thought maybe you could give us sort of a helpful overview of what the SEC is doing right now in its regulation by enforcement action, and then what the Blockchain Association's impact litigation strategies would be for that.
Yeah, happy to. So just to step back and do like a little bit of context setting, an agency in the US has sort of two responsibilities. One is a rulemaking responsibility, and then another responsibility is enforcing those rules. So typically how it works is an agency will issue a proposed rule, and then the public is allowed to comment on the proposed rule. And there's sort of a back and forth between the agency and industry stakeholders and the general public in like formulation of that final rule. And then the agency can enforce the final rule by bringing enforcement actions and settling with people who are allegedly violating those rules. Now, the SEC recently meaning since Chair Gensler became chair, has sort of so they haven't done any real rulemaking that clarifies when a digital asset is a security. And the last guidance that the SEC issued was in 2019. And it was more so in the context of ICOs. So that's like a very specific situation. And if a digital asset is bought or sold or issued outside of that context, it's possible that a different analysis applies, but there's no clarity. And projects in the space have spent countless hours and money trying to analyze whether their assets are securities and need to be registered with the commission. And so instead of issuing any rulemaking, the commission has this view that the securities laws are already clear. So like the Howey test is clear and it's clearly applied to digital assets. But in each and every enforcement action that they bring against a digital asset project, they're basically like propounding new theories of the law within these enforcement actions. And so these enforcement actions now have become really the only way that the industry and entrepreneurs and projects can understand how the SEC views the securities laws as applied to digital assets. But this is a problem because each case is unique and has its unique set of facts and circumstances that might not totally align with the project. That's like trying to analyze and understand how the securities laws apply. So they sort of have to like read between the lines as to what the SEC thinks rather than having like a clear rule. And then also the projects that are trying to understand how the SEC is analyzing the laws, there's no way for them to engage with the agency like there would be if the SEC issued a proposed rule, and then there could be, a comment letter process and an engagement process. So the industry has been calling this like strategy regulation by enforcement, because essentially they're bringing these enforcement actions instead of issuing, rulemaking. So hopefully that's a helpful explainer.
Yeah, definitely. And then, I definitely think that there aren't any even enforcement actions against any sort of BRC 20 tokens because, as Jason said, it's a little too early for the SEC to even have got wind of them. I wanted to just read a quotation from Michael Saylor, and I will say that he's not a lawyer or really maybe someone that a lot of people think incredibly highly of, but he is a Bitcoiner. And he said a few weeks ago that if BRC 20 tokens are viewed as fungible tokens to issue unregistered securities, there's a lot of objection to that because it's unethical and it's illegal. Do you guys have any response to why BRC 20 tokens would be unethical? Or we already talked about why they would be illegal a little bit, but just, to refute Saylor potentially.
So with the caveat, I guess for all of us, perhaps, that none of this was legal advice, investment advice, tax advice, or any other kind of advice, or anything other than our personal views, perhaps. I guess I don't know that this necessarily answers the question of why is it unethical, but certainly within the Bitcoin community, there has been pushback about having ordinals, right? And whether that is by certain folks, right? Certainly there's been a difference of opinion in terms of what people believe may represent Satoshi's original vision, right? And whether ordinals fit into that or how they do. Some people think it does, absolutely, and some people perhaps think it doesn't. But I guess to the extent, and this is not anything specific to Michael Saylor, but one could imagine that if you have businesses that are based on this idea that Bitcoin is different from other digital assets, right? And that it does not have the same securities law complications as other digital assets or other blockchains may have encountered in the past, that there could be reasons for which some may say, hey, maybe the thing to do is to leave that alone. And whether that's characterized as unethical or otherwise, yeah, it's hard to know whether that was a comment that was made relatively off the cuff, saying something was, in his view, perhaps not legal or unethical, and whether those were coupled together, or whether it could really be a broader comment as to, you know, what is best for in someone's view for the Bitcoin blockchain.
Got it. Yeah, he is known for sort of saying things that are quotable for the sake of being quotable.
I just to add briefly on that, I'm not sure what he meant really. I don't see it personally. Don't see it being unethical or potentially illegal. I mean, there are, you know, whatever 190 different countries around the world. I don't know which laws would that be even applicable to. But the key thing is that the Bitcoin network doesn't care what Michael Saylor thinks. And ordinals and ordinal transactions are firmly, you know, abiding by Bitcoin network rules. And so in the network and sort of the miners, the nodes and validators, these are all valid transactions, and they pay rightfully for valuable Bitcoin blockchain space. And so, you know, on that note, I don't think the network thinks it's unethical or illegal, or does it care at all.
So since we're almost to the end of this, I thought it might be interesting if everyone could go around and say their view, not their legal advice or their financial advice, but their personal opinion on whether the advent of ordinals is going to make the SEC, Chair Gensler, any future chairs, maybe potentially change their mind about Bitcoin being a security or a commodity or its classification.
Yeah, Molly, I'm happy to. Oh no, Jason, please go ahead.
No, my answer's short. I don't think so. I do not think so at all.
My answer is a little bit different. I think yes. I think the SEC would like to do anything it can to get its hands on Bitcoin, and it will try to do so if it thinks there's a way forward.
Josh or Marissa, any thoughts?
My view is that I think whatever happens with individual BRC20 tokens or other ordinals, that is separate and distinct from Bitcoin, the token itself. But certainly every new development, it appears that the regulators will have a close eye on, but I don't think that it would necessarily have an effect on their view of Bitcoin itself.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that too. I think it's definitely possible that they will, characterize BRC20 tokens as like entirely distinct from Bitcoin and try to grab jurisdiction over them in that way. But at this point, I think it would be very hard for them to change their perspective on whether like Bitcoin itself is a security. But, you know, Bitcoin could be part of an investment contract, even if the underlying asset is not.
Yeah, I think that's 100%. Excuse me, Molly Jane. I agree 100% with Marissa. And I think for Bitcoin advocates, one of the most important developments over the last years is the emerging political consensus that Bitcoin is a commodity. It's opened up a really clear pathway forward for Bitcoin that other crypto tokens simply lack.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Marissa to explain that a little bit more, but then you were able to do that. We have about 1 minute left. I feel like we've covered any ground. Is there anything that any of you guys want to add about potential, regulatory issues for ordinals coming up in the future, or do we feel like we've covered all sides of the issue? Everyone feels confident. Good. Great. I mean, a success. Josh, continue.
That I might say is just that, with innovation, there will be regulatory scrutiny, and that doesn't mean that the innovation still isn't good.
Sometimes I feel like I wish Gary Gensler would hear something like that, but as we know, he'll be in for a while. He's not going to recuse himself, as he said yesterday. All right. Anyway, I'll end it there. Thank everyone. I thank everyone so much for participating in this panel. I've learned a lot, and I hope people listening learned a little bit too.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.